Hey folks, Michael Mann with Michael Mann Security Services. Welcome to the Modern Anarchist Origins and Tactics. All right, how do you get a hold of us quickly? Michael Mann, MichaelMannSecurityServices.com. That is our website. You can send us a message through there. You can call us at 615-606-1006. Scott, that's the first time I think I said your phone number without having to look at it over the last 20-some weeks. You can get us at Scott M, SCOTTM at MichaelMannSecurityServices.com. That's Scott. Or you can get me at contact at MichaelMannSecurityServices.com. Or you can always get us at Safe with Man. That's at Facebook and Instagram. And so we'll answer you pretty quickly if you send us a message that way, most of the time. All right, for folks, so we've got several folks I know that registered, and we'll jump on this one. This is another popular one, we think. So let me go over what we have coming up quickly as we wait on these folks. Hey, if you're in Middle Tennessee, in our area here within driving distance, Friday, September the 11th, Enhanced Concealed Carry. This is a non-firing course, so you don't need actually ammo for this course. This is 4 hours. This goes over concealment of your handgun. We go over some enhanced manipulation techniques, and then I go over just basic tactics inside your vehicle, inside your home, and some inside the public. And then we'll go over also basic security features for your home. So if you need a physical protection system for your home, you've been looking online about what that means, then if you come to this class with us here in Brentwood, Tennessee on the 11th, you're going to learn all that stuff. Okay? So non-firing class. I know ammo's hard to get. And so really, in your firearms practice, very little needs to be live fire unless it's a training class where you have a certified and qualified teacher teaching you what you need to know. Most of your stuff, a lot of your stuff should be dry practice anyway, okay? And then on the 13th, so that's a busy weekend, we have armed vehicle defense, again a non-firing class, and that is fighting from the car with the pistol, all the concepts wrapped around that. There'll be some force stuff inside or in that class, and that is on Sunday, September 13th, same location in Brentwood. So if you're within driving distance of Middle Tennessee and you've got questions on either class, shoot us a message. We'll answer that pretty quickly. Very inexpensive classes, no ammo needed. Most important part, it's tactics and weapons handling, and of course mindset, what it is you're looking for. Okay? And then September the 27th, we have part 2 of our Israeli security concept. We had part 1 this past Sunday for you folks that are on there. Thank you very much. It was a great class. Thank you for all the compliments and the emails. I appreciate it. So we have part 2 on the 27th. So part 1 is threat identification, that adversary process, and understanding what your environment looks like. And this is part 2, how to conduct that field threat assessment once you've identified a potential threat. Okay. Again, that's September 27th. That is a virtually instructor-led training platform or on Zoom. That's from 1 to 4:30 or 1 to 5. Most of these are 4 to 4.5 hour classes on our ISC or Israeli Security Concept. Okay. All right. So what to expect? Listen, just like anything else that we talk about, I could spend 4 hours talking about nothing but Antifa, but I don't want to do that. The idea here is we want to give you a broad overview like we always do of the topic, and that is going to be this anti-fascism or these groups, the things that you're seeing today. So here's the idea behind this. Discussion we had a couple weeks ago on Karl Marx, and before that, the left-wing terrorism. This is part of your threat spectrum. So if you're a church, a synagogue, a mosque, so any house of worship, if you are an executive protection professional, or if you're in corporate security for a facility, this is all about helping you design your threat spectrum, or in the government world, we call it a design basis threat. For the EP folks, if you've not done facility protection, so when you've done your PSA, Personal Security Vulnerability Assessment, actually before you've done your PSVA, you've done a threat assessment. That's really what this is, identifying your adversary. So this is all wrapped around helping you guys with a threat spectrum. And for a lot of you folks watching, this anti-fascist group or anti-fascist groups are part of your threat spectrum. So the idea behind this is to understand the characteristics of the adversary. So to do that, I'm going to go into a review of some left-wing terrorism things that we talked about a couple weeks ago. We're going to get into a quick history of anti-fascism, or these groups that we're talking about. And again, listen, we can talk 4 hours about that. So I'm going to cover some of the main groups and talk about it. You're going to see these similarities and understand where they came from. And then we're going to get into modern day groups, very specifically Antifa very quickly. And then I'm going to get into strategy and tactics, their strategy and tactics, and you're going to be surprised about some things. And we're going to talk about our strategy and tactics as security professionals, very specifically if these folks are fitting in your threat spectrum. Okay? Okay, so let's get into a review quickly. We're going to try and knock this out in about 30 minutes. I've got service tonight at Fellowship. We're bringing all the youngsters back in. I think one of the first times since all this COVID nonsense. So I've got somewhere to go after this, and I'm sure Scott and Warren do also. All right, so let's talk about just a review real quick. So remember, terrorism is the use of violence, fear, or intimidation to achieve political, social, or religious objectives. There are a number of classifications and groups. Very specifically, we're going to be talking about ideological terrorists, the extreme left model. And so the things that you learned about that several weeks ago, you're going to hear that again today. And the reason why we're talking about that is we're showing you how you plug all this stuff in together so you can understand the characteristics of this potential adversary. Also, if we talked about left-wing terrorism, again, all this is influenced by Karl Marx. Remember when we talked about Karl Marx, basically grew up, or as a child was a Jew. His father was an attorney in Germany, and they came from a Jewish family, lived in a Jewish neighborhood because of anti-Semitism at the time. Marx's father had to convert to Lutheranism so he could still practice law and support his family. Obviously, that had to have some sort of impact on Karl Marx. He goes away to college. He was supposed to be an attorney. He is influenced by leftists and by some folks that just had a big influence on his life, and so he ends up studying philosophy, and through that writes the Communist Manifesto, and then this helps to start this revolution. And so the idea is that capitalism, because it's horrible, it's bad, or that's their idea of this, turns into political revolution. We're going to talk about what that means here shortly, which also could lead, hopefully on their side, to a classless society. All of this is predicated on atheist and radical political or radical leftist political views. Okay, some things to remember again as we get into this about the characteristics of left-wing terrorism. You are going to see this as we start to talk about these anti-fascist groups. So there's a political or social objective, or both. There is a focus to create fear and panic, which is what we are seeing today. People are afraid. We were just having a conversation. Is it, would you say 5 million? Yeah, so like since February, there are 5 million new gun owners in the United States of America, and that is absolutely outstanding. And a big part of that is because of fear and uncertainty and the things that are being created by these groups today. So remember, characteristics of left-wing terrorism, or really any terrorism, is to create fear and panic, and that's a big focus, and that's what we're seeing today. Well-planned tactics and objectives. Some folks look at Antifa and they think it's just a bunch of kids that were in their mom's basement playing video games. They put masks on, they go out and they burn some stuff down. That's not the case. I'm going to show you, because we need to understand the characteristics of those adversaries listed on a threat spectrum. That's not true. They do plan. In fact, some of this is very well planned, and there's a reason for that in the history, and we'll get into it. Requires media attention and an audience. That is for their protection, and that is to spread the word of what it is that they're trying to convince everybody of. And so that this idea that capitalism is bad, that our current form of government is bad, that the police are bad, that the military are bad, so they need media attention. They need that audience. And it also obviously helps to spread that fear and panic. In this case, it's created 5 million new gun owners, which is awesome. All right, so creates financial and ideological support. We see this with some other groups today. We have corporations, we have sports teams that are jumping on and pouring money into these groups to support them, and so it creates some financial and ideological support for the groups themselves. And then again, the strategy on all this is overreaction. It's an overreaction from the public, an overreaction from the police, an overreaction from anybody that counters what it is that these groups are involved with. Okay? So even though those are the characteristics of left-wing terrorism, because that's what this is, you're going to see all those characteristics here. All right, let's get into just modern history. Now remember, we can talk 4 hours on history and all the different groups that have influenced Antifa today, where they come from. This goes back 80 to 100 years back, but we're going to try to cover some things very quickly, give you some broad ideas of where this is coming from. So what is anti-fascism? So it's an illiberal politics of social revolution. We'll talk about what revolution means to them, or revolutionism, applied to fighting the far right. So not only literal fascists, but the far right. And we talk about the far right today. Look, the far right in their idea is anybody that's a capitalist, that believes in capitalism, but believes in their country, a Christian, right, a Jew, anybody that has any kind of religious beliefs, that could be a fascist today or somebody on the far right. Okay, anti-fascists or Marxists, anarchists, anti-authoritarians. The idea behind this is this adapting this pre-existing socialist, anarchist, and communist currents to a sudden need to react to this fascist menace. So the idea is to convince the public and to convince the audience that there is this need to react to this far right, that there is a threat there, that there is a danger. And of course, to this mindset, if you're a conservative, you're far right, there is a threat. Okay? But not the threat, not the physical threat that they're talking about. So where does this come from? Where's the history? So I'm going to go over just a couple of groups real quick so you can kind of understand the ideology behind this and that none of this is new. Okay? And some of this may create some confusion. Some things I do have answers for you for, some things I do not. But I will tell you what we know about this, and then I'll kind of go over some stuff at the end. So 43 groups. So this goes back to post-World War II Great Britain. So before UN Resolution 181, that was actually, I think it was 1947, and Israel becomes a state in 1948, the world was aware of the Holocaust. The world knew what was happening to the Jews, but really it came to the forefront in 47 and right around 48 when Israel became a state. But people really started to talk about it then. They knew it was happening, but there was something I read a while back. You can see news clips, you can read things, but until it's happening like on your street, in your area, and it impacts you, then it really isn't happening in your mind. And so what happens, World War II ends, and the former veterans of the British Army or of England's Army come back home, the Jews very specifically, and they start to experience anti-Semitism at a very, very high level. So even though the war is over, people believe the Nazis have been defeated, what starts to seep back into Europe is anti-Semitism. And a group of veterans see this very, very plainly. And so what they do is they get together and they put a group together and they call it 43 Group. And that number initially comes from the number of people as they started forming, and then that group started to grow. But the idea was the group of these Jews were to get together and they were to fight this fascism, these Nazis that were getting together and spreading anti-Semitism. Now, the issue behind this was everyone in the group were not Jews. Everybody wasn't just fighting anti-Semitism. What ended up happening was there were some non-Jews that joined the group, and they were socialists and they were communists. Now, 43 Group had what they call a 3D system. Number one is discuss the problem. So what is the problem? Identify what the problem is. Decide, like, what is the answer? What are we going to do? And then go out and do it. And so then execute whatever that decision is. So here's what they did. So there's one very specific group that they fought, and you can go in. There's a book. In fact, the book is called 43 Group. I read the book. You can get it on Amazon. It's pretty inexpensive, and you can get it on your Kindle. Very good history, a great book on 43 Group. I suggest if you're interested in this, you go back in there and read it to understand again about the history, what they accomplished, what happened, and as they started to evolve, what happens in their future. And so really what they would do is they had kind of this three-pronged attack or this strategy. And number one was physical attack. So what they would do is they would go to these groups where these fascists or these Nazis were speaking, or anti-Semites or Semites were speaking, and 43 Group created like a commando unit. And what this commando unit would do is they would attack these Nazis or these anti-Semites. The second was to gather intelligence. And so what they would do was they would collect intelligence on the adversaries. They were so good at this that they infiltrated their number one adversary for several years. In fact, at one point, they were able to get a 43 Group kind of like an agent to act as the bodyguard for the leader of one of these fascist groups, one of these anti-Semite groups. And so because they were able to get people on the inside, they knew what was happening, so they would show up, they would physically attack, they would protest, and they would do things to break up these meetings and these protests that were happening. And then they would also pass out propaganda, and that was through a newspaper that they called On Guard. So they were very clear about communicating about what their goals were. Now, just some tactics, and these are going to be, again, some things that are going to sound familiar to you, but at the time in Britain, so there were some things that were illegal, even though people were saying some very bad things about Jews and about other things that were happening, that happened back before the war had started. Those things were legal. And so because 43 Group wanted to fight this, and they wanted to fight back hard, we talked about, remember, they had commando groups that would conduct these physical attacks. What they would do is they had to have weapons, but they don't want to have weapons and get into a fight with these folks because the police were there where they could be arrested because they had something. So here's what they did. They found things that they could legally possess and that they could conceal. And one was potatoes. What they did with the potatoes was they embedded the potatoes with razor blades so that as they would hit their adversaries with them, obviously it would cut them. Light bulbs, they would use light bulbs to throw because actually in the book 43 Group, one of the folks in the group that they're or in the book that they're talking to, and he's telling stories of what happened. He said in there that they were like exploding bombs. So think about throwing a light bulb at somebody, it hits them, the light bulb does explode, and so it causes injury. And then they would use umbrellas because legally they could walk around with umbrellas, but what they do with the points is they poke people in the ears, or they'd actually poke them in other orifices that you could just think of, especially from behind, and they would do that in these fights so they could injure and create this significant impact on their adversaries. And so that way, when they got in these physical confrontations, the fights, and they would break up these big groups, the people that were actually there in these groups and came to watch these anti-Semites, when they got injured, they would remember what happened so they wouldn't come back. So it was deterring. So it's some things we talk about, like in the Israeli security concept and in physical security, using the same tactics. They wanted to deter their adversary, psychologically impact their motivation to come back and do this again. Okay, so 43 Group, there's a book called 43 Group, and it talks about their fight with Mosley, who was leader of this Labor Party, who was their number one adversary. If you want to learn more about it, I suggest you can get that on Kindle through Amazon. It's a great book. You can read it in a night. Okay. Then there was ARA, or what they call anti-racist actions. That was a European-style militant anti-fascist group that was actually formed in Minneapolis in the late 1980s, I think in 1987 initially. And what they called them was the Ballies, because that was a group of anti-fascist skinheads, believe it or not. And so their activities, this sounds very familiar, or it should because we just talked about it, was education, and that was through propaganda. So they would educate people about their mission through propaganda, just like 43 Group, and that's where they got this. Direct action, so they would also be engaged in violence and violent activities or confrontations with their adversaries. And then, of course, confrontation, and confrontation is civil disruption. So if there was a group speaking about something that they disagreed with, that they believed to be fascist, then they would go out and they would yell and they would scream and they would confront them in the public. And so, again, psychologically impacting the motivation for the people to show up at these events. Just some of their points of unity. We go where they go. So they did not wait for these fascist groups or what the group they believed to be fascist. They would actually gather intelligence, and they would follow these groups around, and then they would go and follow through on these tactics. So whether that was violent confrontations, whether that was the use of propaganda to try to shut it down, or whether they would just confront them and be loud and scream and try to disrupt the event itself. We don't rely on the cops or the courts to do work for us, and so violence. And so they were a violent group, and so they wouldn't depend on the police because they actually thought the police and the courts are part of the problem. Because, again, just like 43 Group and some of the groups we're going to talk about, or the one group we're going to talk about here in just a minute, again, they hate the capitalist system, and so they think anything that's in that system is just part of the problem. So they handle everything themselves. So if they had to confront somebody or they wanted to stop somebody, then they would do that violently or through these confrontation tactics. Non-sectarian defense of other anti-fascists. So here's their idea, or here was their idea. Look, there are other anti-fascist groups out there that don't agree with anything they do. They may come from different societies. They may come from different socioeconomic statuses, but they didn't care. The idea was if it was an anti-fascist group, they should come together, they should get along, because the mission, the overall mission, is the same at the end, which is smart. And They support, or they did support, abortion rights and reproductive freedom. So obviously, if we start to look at the things that they support, and obviously if you're a Christian, then that's something that you cannot support. So again, your view is something that they would consider to be fascist. So just again, going back to just Karl Marx theory, when we talk about ideological terrorism in the left, and then we talked about 43 Group, and then of course now ARA, we see everything how this connects. Okay, so just a quick history again. We're 20 minutes into this, and I could just right now still be talking about the history of Karl Marx. So just an overview of where this comes from. So very quickly, let's get into these modern anti-fascists, and we're going to get into what you've been waiting on, and that's Antifa. So here's the deal with Antifa. Again, this goes all the way back to the groups we just talked about. None of these tactics are new. I'm going to show you these tactics, and they're going to reflect directly on some of the things I just talked about that were happening 80 years ago. So with Antifa, very, very anti-law enforcement and anti-U.S. military, because they believe the U.S. military and law enforcement in the United States to just be part of a bad capitalist system that does nothing but promote racism. Again, Marxist theory, there is a push for a classless system. Everyone should be the same. They refuse to accept the legitimacy of a capitalist system, so they want to abolish the capitalist system. They oppose free speech, very clearly oppose free speech. So if you don't believe what they believe, they don't believe that you should say it. They don't believe that it should be written down. They don't believe it should be in the media, so they oppose free speech. Fighting for anarchy and communism, and here when we talk about revolution, we talked about this with Marx, we talked about this with some of the other groups. Revolution is the destruction or abolishment of Western civilization. So this is the beliefs of Antifa, and this goes back to these other groups we talked about. Now, this is a video that was, or a news story that came back or out in 2017 after the Charlottesville, Virginia event, and you're going to be very shocked, because I was going back to find this, where the media is actually not really saying a whole lot of good things about Antifa. They're talking about groups that protest and how they can be violent, and it just showcases who Antifa is, because at the time, a lot of Americans really didn't know, right?
By most accounts, almost all of the people protesting against the hateful bigots, the Nazis and Klansmen in Charlottesville, were peaceful, but not all of them. In their midst was a sometimes very violent group of protesters that call themselves Antifa, known to not only clash with bigots, but also sometimes with police and occasionally storefronts. At least 2 journalists in Virginia were assaulted by violent counter-protesters over the weekend, including this cameraman from the Richmond CBS affiliate. CNN's Sarah Ganim now takes us inside Antifa and shows us this group like you've never seen it before.
It's 6 a.m. in Portland, Oregon, and we're headed to a bar with blacked out windows.
They wanted to meet us really early in the morning because they're concerned about a lot of people being around.
We are meeting members of the Rose City Antifa, short for anti-fascist. This group's main goal is to disrupt neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but also take on government and capitalism.
Antifa is any group that's willing to stand up against fascists by any means necessary.
By any means necessary, they say, can mean outing a white nationalist at their work or to their neighbors. Or, as we've seen recently, violence, fires, property damage, hand-to-hand combat at protests across the country.
Explain to me the reasoning behind fighting.
You have to make it so unpalatable to be doing white supremacist organizing that they no longer want to do that. And historically, that's what's worked. You have to put your body in the way.
So psychologically impact your adversary's motivation to be at the event.
Now again,
there's no firm number on how many Antifa activists there are in the U.S.
Antifa shows up in events they just don't believe in. It can be somebody protesting abortion. It could be a pro-law enforcement event. You're going to see that in just a minute. So they're going to do anything they can to psychologically impact the people that are there to try to get them not to come back.
And the election of President Donald
And they will do that through violence.
Violence and property destruction led to more than 200 arrests in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day. Prosecutors say they were wearing masks covered head to toe in black, a tactic the Antifa call black bloc.
People dress in black bloc for a few things. One,
Scott Crow has been leading anarchist and militant leftist groups for decades.
So people put on the masks so that we can all become anonymous. And then therefore we are able to move more freely and do what we need to do, whether it is illegal or not.
So some people will push back on that and say that the black bloc is to keep people from being identified and arrested when they break the law, when they commit crimes.
Damn right. It's a good way to avoid the ramifications of law enforcement.
We saw that firsthand at a May Day protest in New York City.
We cover our face because the Nazis will try to find out who we are. And that is a very bad thing because they harass people. When they organize, they kill people, they hurt people, they fight people. And we're the ones who are fighting back. They are the second coming of Hitler.
Police in Berkeley told us they haven't seen this kind of destruction since the 1960s. Law enforcement in other cities are dealing with similar situations, like in Portland, Oregon, where Antifa have been involved in at least 10 protests ending in violence, according to police. And it's wearing on the community.
It is new. It's like this rumble mentality of, I'm going to bring my friends, you bring your friends, and we're going to fight it out in the park. It's not something we've seen here. It's not good for the city. People are just frustrated by it. It's affecting their livability. It's affecting their business.
It was back in 2017, folks. It's 3 years ago.
It happens quicker. The fire starting that we saw on May Day is something we haven't really seen much of in the past. The running through the street, breaking windows and everything in sight. We haven't seen it as consistently as we've seen it in the last 8 months.
But it's the violence that's gotten them attention, directly confronting groups that preach white nationalist rhetoric, like on Inauguration Day, when white nationalist Richard Spencer was punched in the face. And it was the Antifa movement that caused Berkeley to cancel speeches by extreme right provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos.
If there are the more hardcore elements, the white supremacists and neo-Nazis that go to these rallies that are itching for a fight, we're there to say, we'll stand in your way.
The thing is, Jake, that experts who I've talked to say that the Antifa violence may end up actually hurting their cause. Across the country, people who are dressing in black bloc are getting arrested. Authorities are taking this serious.
All right, so when we start to talk about kind of this struggle against fascism, so Antifa's, there's 3 elements that they're going to use in this struggle, and again, which they believe to be fascism. So number 1, you've seen this, physical resistance. Number 2, political organization. And 3, propaganda. So here, just a video you're going to see here next. So this is a Black Lives Matter event that actually is peaceful until somebody walks up. And remember, we talked about these forms of unity with ARA, where even though maybe there's another group that doesn't mesh or agree 100% with ARA, all anti-fascist groups should work together, even if they don't agree 100%. And so here's an event. I think this is in Austin, Texas. It's peaceful. There's some sort of I think it's some sort of rally against the police. There's a young lady here that's in support of the police. Nobody bothers her, and so this anti-fascist walks up and physically assaults this young lady. And you'll see a peaceful protester. A lady comes out and she says, "No, hey, listen, we're here to peacefully protest. This is not the way to do this. This is not going to help." And you can see that doesn't do any good. So we start to talk about, again, psychologically impacting people who, and again, this is some young lady who's pro-law enforcement. I don't know if maybe her husband's a police officer, maybe her brother's a police officer, maybe she's just a good American and she likes the police. And so just because she stands there with a sign which is free speech, again, these groups oppose free speech. It's bad. You are racist or you're horrible if you don't agree with what they agree with. So again, just you're going to see just another example of some of the tactics and what this looks like. And this young lady tries to do everything she can to get away from this and get out of it. And then again, a peaceful protester comes up and tries to get this anti-fascist to stop, and she doesn't.
These two, hello, can you guys hear me? I think we need to put the music on pause.
fuck out of here, you stupid bitch!
Sorry,
This is
there's
the fucking
bad
place for that! Get the fuck out of here! You look like a fucking idiot! You look like a fucking idiot, you stupid bitch! Get that shit out of my fucking face!
I'm just filming.
Get that shit out of my fucking
So
face!
here's confrontation. Remember, we talked about some of the strategy. So, we talked about confrontation, we talked about physical violence, we talked about gathering intelligence. So here what we've got is she's confronting her, trying to get her to put the sign down and leave, and you're going to see in a second that doesn't work. It doesn't work to the point of even a peaceful protester comes up and tells this very nice young lady with the bandana around her face to stop because it doesn't do good. So here we have a peaceful protester and says, hey, just stop this.
I'm here to express my First Amendment rights. I'm not bothering anybody.
So now confrontation is not working. So remember one of the strategies behind this.
Let her do her, sis.
So the other,
I watched you come up here and sit here, and I watched as people came towards you, and that's not okay. We can't advocate for peace, and we're attacking people. Let her do what she want to do.
I'm curious about what you've heard because this is extremely distressing to me. Whoa, whoa, hey.
So the confrontation didn't psychologically impact her ability, so now it turns into violence.
I need you to stop. Listen, look at me, look at me, look at me.
We can't have.
I understand.
Look, we can't have the.
And now it turns into physical violence. Okay. So, just the basic strategy behind Antifa, who they are. Now, if you watch this on TV and you see these people that they're dressed in black or this blackout strategy, and for the most part, I mean, I've heard people say it's just a bunch of kids in basements that are playing video games, and then they come out and dress up, and they're not really a threat. Well, I'll tell you that they are a threat. And so remember, we talk about knowing our adversary, knowing our enemy, the characteristics when we start talking about a threat spectrum. Never underestimate who it is that we at some point may have to protect our principal or our facility against. And so not only Read 43 Group, again, it's on Kindle, it's on Amazon. This is something that I would not normally buy or read, but this is actually the handbook for Antifa, and it's written by somebody by the name of Mark Bray, and Mark Bray is a journalist who ended up following these folks around for a while. And there's some things in here that are questionable, but there's a bunch of good information here about if this is a person or this is a group on your threat spectrum that you want to know. When you go to Appendix A of this book, so I read the book, and some of it's funny, some of it's sad. But if you go to Appendix A, it talks about advice from the anti-fascists of the past and present to those of the future. And so it gives advice. And so here's some of the advice that you've got, and most of the stuff that I've put up now, these are people from Antifa. So this is not folks from the past. The majority of these are, and I look to see, I want to get some modern views or some modern advice from people that were just talking about this that Bray actually interviewed or that he took notes from. I want you to hear what they have to say. Okay, so if we think these are people just in their basements, and their mom's paying their rent, they're playing video games, think again. These things are very, very well planned out. If you go back to the video in 2017, and then we talked about, they were talking about Charlottesville, but also if you look at what was happening in Portland at the time and fast forward now 3 years, what this strategy looks like and what it's turned into. So you've got 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago, you've got the media that weren't necessarily on Antifa's side. They didn't agree with what was going on. And now what you've got in 2020, you've got cities and you've got mayors that are allowing them to take over. And this is all based on strategy. It's based on propaganda. It's based on the physical violence. It's based on all the things. And when we start to talk about the characteristics of terrorism, it starts to talking about this audience that's needed. So they need the media. And so you've got the media that necessarily didn't agree with them 3 years ago, and now you've got a media standing by that's watching all this, that's recording it, sending it out to the rest of the world, and you've got cities that are letting this happen. So you can see very quickly how this escalates, and this is not a joke. And so these folks should be taken very seriously. So here's some things that are said. Do your research. So remember we talked about the 4 requirements for conducting a successful attack. And really this comes out of another manual, another communist manual. And number 1, of course it's true, it's the same tactics we would use. So number 1, You've got to gather detailed information about your adversary. Number 2, you got to have the element of surprise. Number 3, you must have control, which most of the time talks about the weapons. And then, of course, number 4, you got to be mobile. You got to be able to move around. You got to follow the adversary around. So here's some things that are said about these people hiding in their basement, or this is quotes from people hiding in their basement. Do your research. One of the most effective things you can do as an anti-fascist is understand your opponent. Know where they meet, how they organize, then be effective in how you disrupt them. And they've been very effective at that over the last 3 years. Again, go to 2017, the first video, and look at what's happening now to see how effective they've been. Understand which resources the far right have. Now, they didn't say fascist, they said far right. If you're a Christian, if you're a believing Jew, or if you believe in any religion, you could be considered far right. Okay, so if you've got any view that is against theirs, notice here they just said far right, they didn't say fascist. I'm a believer. I'm a military veteran. I was a police officer for 12 years. I've worked for the government, protecting government facilities. In the private sector now, I protect things that both belong in our capitalist society, which is a great thing, and I protect Christian institutions. So I could be considered far right and adversary for these folks. Okay, so understand which resources the far right have. Gather personal information about where they live, where they work, what they do, which ideas are spread in their societies, so you are able to react in the same scale. Start self-defense and weapons training immediately because you are confronting people with militarized training. They are prepared for street battle. They understand. They know. They're starting to experience this now. If you're not paying attention to what's going on in Kenosha, Wisconsin, turn on the news and see people in Kenosha, Wisconsin are now fighting back. A number of protesters, I think there was 2 as of today. There's some pretty violent videos about it, but people are now starting to fight back, and of course they've known this was coming, so they're getting ready for it. Get in shape. Even though there may not be street fighting at this time, the alt-right encourages their people to get in shape and go shooting. Take self-defense classes and learn how to use guns if you are comfortable doing so. So again, this is a threat. This is a very specific threat. They should be taken very seriously. And again, this just goes back to things that have been going on for over 100 years. So strategy for us as protectors, what does that mean? So the adversary uses well-planned tactics. We need to do the same thing. So number 1, develop your threat spectrum and then reevaluate that constantly. All right. Maybe this group isn't in your threat spectrum depending on who it is you're protecting or what you're protecting. But again, get that DBT or what we call a threat spectrum and reevaluate that constantly. And understand the characteristics of your adversary. Know your DBT. Study your adversary. I didn't really, actually there was parts of reading this book that I did enjoy because I learned some things I didn't know before. It's a good idea to read these things and understand where they're coming from, who they are, what their motivations are, what their history is, because that helps you defeat. That'll help you defeat them if you have to. So study your adversary, study their motivations and their tactics. That's going to be important so you can provide physical protection for your principal or for your facility. Use open source intelligence tools, guys, ladies. There were some seminars way back where we talked about several weeks ago where I gave you some open source resource, those tools that are free. So if you don't have the money or the resources to go out and spend money on risk management platforms, again, go back and research. Scott, do you remember which one that was? We talked about like Eventbrite. We talked about what was that, Protest Watch or something. Okay, if you want to know, drop your email address to Scott. We'll send you which webinar that was because, again, there's some free stuff in there that you guys can use. So use those open source intelligence tools to find out about where these folks are going to be. Identify high-risk activities and protect your assets. So, look, if you got a principal, obviously in your advance, you guys are already doing this. Same thing with folks protecting facilities. Again, are there high-risk events going on in your area? Use those open source tools and shoot Scott an email, and he'll tell you what webinar that was. And pay attention to that and protect the assets to try to keep them from that, mitigate that impact as much as possible, keep them away from that risk. Okay? Surveillance detection programs are key to success, folks. Number 1, that goes to understanding your adversary. Number 2, understanding what surveillance looks like or what it may look like. Number 3, getting into that, validating that what that surveillance is, and that we teach that in the Israeli security concept. And then, of course, number 4, having some sort of system where you can document, report, and disseminate that information. Those are the main elements of that surveillance detection program. This kind of gets into that. Implement that SAR, that suspicious activity reporting process. We've talked about that in detail, and again, in our Israeli security concept, we teach that. We give you those tools. Here's something very important, especially off the a couple of last things that they said about getting in shape. Take weapons classes, use how to learn use guns, learn how to fight. Folks, if you're in the security profession, if you're protecting a church, any house of worship, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, if you're protecting a principal, or if you're protecting a corporation, and at some point you may have to step in between your adversary and your facility or your principal, you need to understand your use of force continuum. You don't have to be a police officer to have a use of force continuum. Remember, that use of force continuum is that standard you're going to use that's going to tell you the amount of force that can be used in any situation that you may get into. So understand what your use of force continuum is, what is legal, what you can do, what you can't do. Understand what intermediate weapons or what weapons you can have and how to use them, and go out there and get that training. The adversary, if Antifa is one of your adversaries, they are telling their folks and other anti-fascist groups, go out there, prepare for battle. Because again, going back 3 years ago, the media didn't necessarily agree with these groups. Today, they're videoing this, they're watching it, they're streaming it out to the rest of the world, and cities are literally allowing, or these governments are allowing their cities to burn. They're allowing this to happen. So look at the change and the impact that these tactics have had. Okay, so understand your use of force continuum. Go out there and get that use of force training, because again, at some point this may become important for you. Mark Bray, B-R-A-Y, and I would also, 43 Group is the name of the book. There's some very interesting things in that book. Again, it's on Amazon. You can get that in Kindle, and that gives you a really good history of, again, some of the tactics that these folks are using. Any other questions? All right. Okay, folks, be careful. Thanks again for tuning in. We hope to help you. We're at 41 minutes. Again, we could spend 4 hours on just the history. There's about 6 different groups that go all the way back to Germany, communists very specifically in the 1930s. We just don't have time to cover all of them. Some other groups in the 70s that were here in the U.S. that were tied directly to Weather Underground, which is another left-wing terrorist organization we talked about a couple of weeks ago. We just couldn't cover it. So, again, thanks for joining us. We'll have another interesting topic for you this next week. We'll put that out. We hope to do that on Friday. It'll be on the threat spectrum again, like we've talked about before. So be careful. We hope our advice helps, or the things that we talk about help you. And if you have any questions, please send us an email. And again, we appreciate all the folks that are coming to our training or attending our training. We hope we're helping you folks also. And of course, always remember, folks, it is about prevention, not response.